the couple that died within hours of each other, it just becomes something superficial that you heard about. And if we're not talking about it, we forget about it.
So do you guys mind turning on your camera? If that's okay.
2020, I've spent the majority of the time working in the ER.
I've been completely isolated ever since the pandemic started, basically.
Both full-time as a physician and also part-time through a locums tenens, where you're like a rent-a-doc, and I traveled all over the US.
My perspective might be a little bit different than a lot of people because the year before, I was battling breast cancer. So it's kind of like 2020 was on 2019 on repeat.
Hundreds of thousands of small businesses closed this year.
We had approximately 24 hours notice that we needed to close.
Mine did the complete opposite of closing. We flourished.
We were actually decently excluded from PPP because we had just opened in 2019.
Members of our community literally stood in front of our store all night and told people hey, this is a Black-owned store. Please don't. They're doing community work. Please don't.
Giving birth was definitely my defining moment in 2020. I was worried I was going to have postpartum depression. I ended up having more postpartum anxiety.
For me, the defining moment in 2020 was remote learning, paying attention to the mental toll that it takes.
When I ask my kids about coming back, they're about 50-50 anxious about the virus, anxious about seeing other people. But it's the social learning loss that I think is just it's kind of incalculable, especially if you're in your early teenage years.
Some background. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and my greatest fear in life is a global pandemic.
I've been an ER doctor for years, and I love disaster. This is the stuff that I personally trained and got ready for years.
A lot of people in my community here haven't taken it seriously.
We didn't really see anything firsthand. It's more of kind of just seeing on the news, reading news articles.
I think there's also a betrayal that I felt in 2020.
We did have a patient come in. I don't know why she came in. She came in huffing and puffing, could barely walk.
You look at other people and you're trying to do everything possible to prevent it from spreading.
Literally laid on the counter and said, "I'm here." I went back and told the doctor that, she was not well. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital. She was diagnosed with COVID.
They're not wearing their mask and they get mad if I tell them to wear their mask even though it's required. They start telling me, "Stop being a communist."
Some people will never understand that this thing is very serious. They think the government or the person who's in power is just doing something else to let them stay in, not knowing it is for their own safety.
This hasn't hit people all in the same way.
There were some people who kind of thought that COVID didn't exist.
I studied for 12 and a half years to become a doctor to tell you information.
Trying to say it was like the flu. And if you don't do anything about it, it'll work its way through.
My patients argue with me that they know more because somebody on social media is pushing medical treatment or refusing a medical treatment. And I think that 2020 is going to have a big black mark on it as, the year we all want to forget.
This is a weird moment of transition.
Those moments in that part of life, happened. It's a shared experience that we have to remember. Not everybody had the same 2020.
In Puerto Rico, if we see that the government is actually taking a good response to something, for example, the COVID-19, that wear masks, social distance, clean your hands, we do it. Or go to your houses. Please go to your houses because this is something good for the community. And man, we did it.
South Carolina, I had a husband and wife, both had COVID.
Unfortunately, at the end of 2020, my parents got COVID.
The wife was much worse. No matter how much oxygen we're giving her, her body just wasn't absorbing the oxygen.
My father unfortunately passed away. He had been put into a nursing home for rehabilitation.
So I remember having them trying to talk to each other. They're literally in a room right next to each other, separated by a wall, but they're talking to each other via Zoom.
There was an outbreak there because she had it. When his case went severe, she was able to go up and be with him.
And I remember being with the husband. I'm like, look, you need to talk to her. If this is what you want me to do, you want me to intubate her. I put a tube in her mouth and put her on her ventilator and breathe for her. This is probably the last time you're going to talk to your wife.
Thankfully, Dad was able to have her nearby.
And he was in tears and he wanted to go hold her. And I couldn't let him leave his room. I couldn't let him endanger the rest of my department.
I was on FaceTime, just kind of, being there and watching over him.
But these two have been married for 40, 50 years. So he's like, baby, I love you. I'll see you. Within 6 hours, she was dead.
It's such a monumental event.
His kids can't come into the hospital. He actually refused to see them on Zoom. He didn't want to see any more family. Couldn't cope with it.
Yeah, you hear so many, reports of people dying alone.
Dying is such a personal thing that is a shared experience. But here we didn't get to have that.
There was no closure.
Death is just another part of life. But here, you can't give a person that level of adaptation that they need. You don't give them the ability to cope the way they need. And then turns around, family has nothing but anger and hate, and they hate the hospital. They hate me as a doctor. Why couldn't I let them in to see their mom? Why couldn't I let them in to see their dad?
A different kind of impact of COVID that has to do with death.
It was horrible. And I think we're not going to see the full effects of that for years to come. So when I see people that, say there's no virus, that there's, we don't need to be wearing masks, they didn't have the same experience that I did. They didn't sit there and hold individuals' hands as they're dying.
The day he died, I went out for a hike, but I went to my favorite park, which burnt in the wildfires. And I just remember sitting on a burnt hill, thinking about Dad and looking at this vista. That actually is probably the defining moment right there, because it's sadness, it's loss, but then there's hope, and there's beauty to still be found. And it's like life is going to go on. There's this big hole in my heart now, but Dad would want me to look at those mountains and enjoy it going forward.